And my name is Beth Long. I'm the coordinator for the Lee Vining branch of Mono County Libraries. And welcome. So excited to talk about fish and books tonight. I want to introduce the director of Mono County Libraries for a brief library update, Christopher Platt.
Hey everyone, I see some really wonderful familiar faces out there. Can you hear me? Nod your head if you can hear me.
Gotcha, Chris.
Awesome, thank you so much. I also, really quickly, I want to first say thank you. Thanks first to Beth Long, our wonderful, fantastic coordinator of the wonderful, fantastic Lee Vining Library, and our Mono Lake volunteers. I see Janet and Rich and on this Zoom. I also want to take a moment to thank Kevin Brown for offering his time to talk about his book and Devils Hole Pupfish. I'm really excited about it. I do really quickly want to just remind you, all 7 Mono County libraries are open for business. If you don't have your library card, come in and introduce yourself to one of our smiling library staff and we will set you up with one. You just need to live, work, or go to school in Mono County. A lot is going on. Even with a pandemic, we are doing virtual story times. We've got Mono Books Box program, which is curated book kits for school-age kids. We've got maker kit activities that are free to take, as well as more in-depth maker kit activities that you can circulate. We have outdoor activity zines that for all ages you can go out and explore these custom little zines doing activities in the Eastern Sierra and learning more about your surroundings outside. And, you know, not forgetting the adults in the room, in addition to co-hosting the Oxygen Starved podcast, which is adventure books and conversation from 11,000 feet. I also, every Friday, or almost every Friday, do a Book Talk Friday, where I share with you 2 great library books, one new and one old, that you can get from a Mono County library. And you can find all of this information on our website, monocolibraries.org, as well as the link to the recording for this event tonight after tonight. I think Rich is going to edit it and get me a link, and we will put it up there so that you can watch it again or share it with other people who didn't get to participate in this program tonight. That's all. You didn't tune in to listen to me. I just want to say thank you. It's wonderful to see all these wonderful faces here, and I'm going to turn it right back over to Beth and let you carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. I also want to introduce Janet Carl, organizer for the Mono Lake Volunteers and Mono Climate Action, to give us a brief update on what's going on there. And co-host of this event tonight as well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we're so thrilled to have such a great crowd to hear Kevin, who's a wonderful speaker. And it's so exciting to have the book out, available at your local library and also at the Mono Lake Committee bookstore. And just wanted to touch base with how, if this is continuing education for our Mono Lake volunteer program. And Beth and I just both were interested in having Kevin speak, and we got together on making this happen tonight. So if you are interested in possibly volunteering at Mono Lake, please contact me, carljanet@gmail.com, and we would be thrilled to have you involved in the program. We do training on a weekend in early June every year, and people ask people to volunteer 8 hours a month, and we have a group of about 100 volunteers actively telling visitors about Mono Lake and all the special things about it. Also, the 350 Mono Climate Group is involved in tonight's production. And just heads up, there is a climate group active in the Mono Basin and also in Inyo County, so Mono County and Inyo County. And we're collaborating together and trying to make some movement happen on dealing with the climate issues that we're all facing. And so Kevin's talk tonight will have a climate theme, a very inspirational theme about how the pupfish have survived with a lot thrown at them. So hopefully that's going to be inspiration as we move forward. So thank you again. Looking forward to hearing Kevin, and going to turn it back over to Beth for the introduction.
Thank you, Janet. And thank you again, Rich, for managing this Zoom tonight. We're going to be muting everybody during Kevin's talk for the next 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for questions, about 15, 20 minutes questions. So if you have a question during the talk, feel free to type it into the chat, and I'll just run through those at the end. and then open it up for further questions. So without further ado, Kevin, I'm so excited that you're here tonight. Kevin received his doctorate in history from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2012, where he wrote a dissertation about the environment, workers, and forestry in the early 20th century lumber industry. After a brief stint as a journalist, he began in 2013 as a postdoctoral researcher for the American Society for Environmental History, which had just received a grant for a report on the history of the Devils Hole Pupfish from the National Park Service. He delivered that report to the National Park Service in 2017. He was also a postdoctoral researcher at UC Santa Barbara in the Environmental Studies program from 2016 to 2018, where he continued to research the pupfish and began writing the book. At UCSB, he also worked on projects on the history of ecological change in California oak woodlands, as well as the extinction of the California grizzly bear. After his funding ended at UCSB, he moved here to the Mono Basin and continued to write and revise his work on the pupfish. And now, 8 years after he started, it is a book. So Devil's Hole Pupfish, The Unexpected Survival of an Endangered Species in the Modern American West by Kevin Brown.
Oh, well, thank you for that really nice introduction, Beth. And let me just go ahead and pull up my slides to go along with this talk, and I'll get started. Let's see here. Okay. All right, so you should all be seeing my slides, title slide right now. And I'd just like to again thank Beth Long and Janet Carl and Rich Foy and Christopher Platt for helping make this happen. And of course, to everyone who's listening, I'm really very grateful that you've taken some time to hear this talk and hopefully learn something about the pupfish and the desert. So I look forward to all questions and comments at the end as well. Among other things, I'm really grateful to be giving this talk in a library, or at least library adjacent on Zoom, because libraries are basically responsible for this book. Historians rely on archives and published studies to help grow knowledge. And I spent a lot of time in a lot of libraries to produce this book. So having it, getting to give a talk in a library or library adjacent, and then also have the book itself in the library catalog is really very meaningful to me. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So tonight, I really just want to do 3 things to tell you a little bit about the work I've done and some of what I think it means. So the first part of the talk, I just want to actually get to how I arrived at the question that is at the heart of the book. In other words, I'm going to start with how I arrived at figuring out what I should write the book about. So my question is basically, that the book revolves around, is how exactly has the Devil's Hole Pupfish survived since the 1890s, and what can that tell us about the US West? Then I'm going to try and give you a brief overview of how I've gone about answering that question. And then I'll conclude with thinking and talking a little bit about the pupfish and climate change and what I think that means. But before we can dive into those 3 topics, we all need to be on the same page with some pupfish basics. So here is a Devil's Hole Pupfish on the screen for you. It's depending on the size of the screen you're looking at this on, it's probably quite a bit larger than the real thing. Devil's Hole Pupfish, each individual is just about an inch long, or the distance from the tip of your thumbnail to that first knuckle below it. So each pupfish is individually very small. There also happen to be very few of them. At times, the total population of Devil's Hole Pupfish have numbered under 40 individuals, which means that the entire species could fit in a water bottle. So that is not too many fish. Devil's Hole pupfish is also only located in one habitat. It has only one natural habitat. It's a bit of a drive from here in Lee Vining, where I'm coming to you from. But as you can see on this map here, I just circled Lee Vining, and then on the east side of Death Valley National Park, there's an area called Ash Meadows. And in the corner of that, there's a 40-acre section of land that is managed by the National Park Service as part of Death Valley National Park. And that is where this habitat for this small group of small fish is. This is what Devil's Hole looks like from the visitor platform, which is raised about 45 or 50 feet above the surface of the water. So in this perspective, you're looking down this steep hill towards Devil's Hole, which is about 10 feet across and 60 feet long. So the small fish with the small population lives in a very small habitat. It may be the most restricted habitat for any vertebrate species. And despite its small opening at the top of this hole, it's actually very deep. And what you're looking into it's a strange experience, because you're looking into an aquifer. And aquifers being underground are rarely seen. But in this case, Devil's Hole is a window into an aquifer, as a couple of scientists put it. And divers from the US Geological Survey have gone down to about 430 feet, and they have not touched bottom or anything. And they also have not found any evidence of the two divers who drowned there in 1965. So it's a very curious habitat. Here's another view of the habitat from the heel of kind of the easiest access point at the southern end. And though it's very deep, the pupfish really use a very small portion of Devil's Hole. And in fact, they only reproduce, spawn, and then have raised the next generation on what scientists call the shallow shelf, which is 10 feet across by about 20 feet long, and is submerged under the waterline by only a few inches to a couple feet. So in this small habitat, they're reproducing on an even smaller area that's barely below the waterline. And we're gonna come back to why that's important later. The water is also a constant 92 degrees, and it has very low dissolved oxygen. Sunlight doesn't even hit the water for a good chunk of the year. So it makes this a really extreme environment for a vertebrate like the pupfish to live in. So the Devil's Hole pupfish is an extreme species in some way. Now, if you're thinking, are there other pupfishes? The answer is yes. Oh, let me quickly pause. I got ahead of myself there. The population of Devil's Hole pupfish, this chart illustrates that, has fluctuated over time. They tend to have a much larger population in the fall than in the spring. But since about 1996, the population has declined pretty dramatically, which has led to these very low population levels. There has been some rebound since 2014, which is at the right end of the chart, but not certainly not back to levels seen in the 1980s and early 90s. So we'll also talk a little bit more about that as I go through. But the habitat is surrounded by this fence. It's designed to keep people out. And if you go there, you're even in like a smaller kind of fenced in area when you're on the visitor platform. And you can see that in the middle distance there. But the area around Devil's Hole is quite arid. It's in the Amargosa Desert. But let's see. Oh yes, so I was saying there are other pupfishes, yes. This photo is from a pupfish habitat at the southern end of Death Valley called Saratoga Springs, and it's the home to the Saratoga Springs pupfish. But that's not it. In fact, just in what the people who study these fishes call the Death Valley region, between like Bishop and Saratoga Springs, there are actually 10 species or subspecies of pupfish that have evolved in these different isolated spring habitats. And the Devil's Hole pupfish, Cyprinodon diabolus, is one of those. And 9 of these species are extant. One of them, the Tecopa pupfish, is extinct. So pupfish as a genus are also spread out across the Southwest US. There's some populations in Mexico, the Caribbean, and there's even one on the East Coast of the US. So they are widespread, but yet this species and these species in the Death Valley region are all really isolated. So let's see. Okay, so I want to move on to the first section of my 3 parts. That to start with, how did I get to the question that I asked in this book? And apologies if this seems a little too self-indulgent, but I do think it actually helps put the story I'm trying to tell in a larger context of what's going on right now, particularly around extinction. So as kind of Beth said a little bit of in her nice introduction, I started working on this in 2013, about 8 years ago. And I knew when I applied for this job, working for the Park Service as a contractor, I knew even less than the little review I just gave you about pupfish. I had finished working on my doctorate in environmental history, which is a field that's really devoted to thinking about how human relationships with nature have changed over time. But we do that by using the tools of sort of traditional history. In other words, we sit in archives and look at manuscripts. We interview people. We try and find other sources of historical information, and then tell a story about how humans and whatever element in the non-human world we're interested in have interacted, maybe influenced each other, and so forth. And so I saw this ad for this opportunity to do that related to this fish that I'd never heard of. And I was going to try and find a photo of myself from 2013 to show how like young and happy and innocent I was before I got invested in trying to unravel the mysteries of the pupfish. But I couldn't find one that was showed me as appropriately happy. And in any case, by about 2016, when I finished the first draft of this work that I eventually turned into a book, I finished this report for the Park Service. I'd been to a few dozen or a couple dozen archival locations, people's homes, government offices, libraries, special collections. I'd interviewed a dozen people, and I'd kind of cranked out this pretty long report for the Park Service as a document that would hopefully be useful for managers who are interested in how the species has been managed by the park since it became their responsibility. And then maybe also it'd be useful for a new, park superintendent to get up to speed with, what's going on with this fish. And I think, by finishing writing that, I knew a great deal about the pupfish in very specific ways. I knew lots of little stories and lots of moments when managers tried different things to help the pupfish survive. But what I didn't know really that well at that point, and I felt very self-conscious about this, is I was like, what is the story here though? Like, what's the bigger story that connects to all these other things in US history that I'm interested in, like the history of science? How is it connected to changes in land management in the West, to the use and abuse of water in the West? And I didn't really have a great handle on all that at that point, and I didn't really know how to make it all fit together. And then around that, as I was finishing this report, which I hope remains useful to those managers because they are a specific audience, I received this fellowship at UCSB, and all of a sudden I was thrust into these research groups that were wrestling with these really wide-ranging issues. And one in particular that became really foundational for me in rethinking the pupfish book was this group focused on the extinction of the California grizzly bear. They now have a name, the California Grizzly Research Network. And in the early days of that group in 2016, I was working with historians, but a lot of ecologists on trying to learn more about the extinction of the California grizzly bear, about its historical ecology, including what it ate, and also thinking through the possibilities for reintroduction. But while I was doing that, I kept thinking about, well, like, what am I going to do about this pupfish story? So I had this idea, I had all these ideas coming at me from the grizzly group about learning about extinction. I started revisiting a lot of books that were among my favorite while I was a graduate student. And one of them is Nature's Ghosts, which is about the idea of extinction, how we learned that extinctions were possible in the 19th century. And this is by Mark Barrow, and those are Carolina parakeets on the cover there, which are an extinct animal. I started reading books about other extinct animals, including the great auk, shown here in this Audubon painting. I also, was reading about the passenger pigeon, and here is a photo of Martha Washington, the last passenger pigeon. She's already been turned into a little bird popsicle in this photo, but she was the last passenger pigeon. I also was thinking about other extinct animals in recent history, including ivory-billed woodpecker. And closer to home, I started recalling all these other fishes that lived in habitats near to Devil's Hole that had become extinct, including the Ash Meadows poolfish, which was first collected by scientists around the same time as the Devil's Hole pupfish, but by the 1940s had become extinct. And then I started reading more broadly about extinction, including, the rates of extinction among freshwater fishes in North America, which, the results of those studies show that the modern extinction rates for freshwater fishes in North America are, almost 900 times greater than what would be expected as a background rate of extinction. There have been 57 species or subspecies that have become extinct since about 1900. And the first species to be removed from the endangered species list by reason of extinction was the Tacopa pupfish, another close relative of the Devil's Hole pupfish. There's a whole literature more broadly about the sixth extinction, the idea that there are these 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history resulted in at least 75% of all species on the planet becoming extinct. And that in fact, humans are now setting off a wave of extinctions that may rival those previous 5, one of which most recently includes the extinction of the dinosaurs, that moment. But here in this graphic from a study 10 years ago shows in white are the percentage of those species in those different categories that are already extinct. And the numbers in black show the percentage of species in each of those categories that are threatened with extinction. So we've already made a good jump towards 75%, though the details and the timing of all this is still somewhat under discussion among scientists. But anyway, the thrust of this is that I was reading a lot about extinction when I got to Santa Barbara. I started going further back into my basket of, going back into my files, finding all these other reports and comments about extinction, including this paper that was published in 2014, right as I was starting my work, that suggests that this is by a scientist at UC Berkeley, suggesting that the likelihood that the pupfish would go extinct in 20 years was about 25%. I also, around that same time, received an email from another person who I contacted to see if they had any records or personal papers about their work on the pupfish in the past. And they wrote back saying that they expected to any day hear that the C. dablus, the Devil's Hole pupfish, is extinct. And maybe you will tell us that it is. I hope not, but I am afraid that it is fading away and that you may be preparing its obituary. So, okay, I'm reading more about this. I'll keep going back in time. In 2006, a prominent pupfish researcher told the Las Vegas Review-Journal that, based on where they were at that point, the worst case scenario, the worst case is extinction in the next 8 months. And then I went all the way back to 1937 and found a letter from a student who later became a very prominent ichthyologist and expert on desert fishes. In 1937, he wrote that while he was at Devil's Hole, he had found that the population had been reduced to no more than 50 or 60 fish. And at this rate, it won't be long until they are extinct. So by like the end of 2016, early 2017, I had been reading about extinction pretty much constantly, and going back through my work, realizing that much of what I'd already been doing was all these people talking about extinction in the pupfish. But the problem was that the pupfish were still there. And so I didn't really know what the story was. I knew that there's this big context about extinction, that human-caused extinction is a massive problem and a crisis. But I had this fish that was still in the hole. And so I eventually came around and realized that this wasn't a problem for me telling the story. This was the story. How is it that the Devil's Hole pupfish has managed to survive the 20th century while many of its close genetic and geographic relatives have become extinct? That's the question. And so with that kind of framing, I tried to be like relentless in rethinking all the work I'd done around that question. And the result of that is the book that came out a few months ago. So apologies that that's a long way to go to get to this question, but I think it's useful because it places the peculiarity of the pupfish in a broader context. It's a very small population animal, which has a high risk of extinction that's persisted for a very long time while others have not. And I want to know why is that? So I'd like to next kind of move and talk about exactly how I think the pupfish managed to survive the 20th century and up to the present. And I'm gonna kind of breeze through that, but hit some of the themes that were really important for me as I wrote it. This image here, first of all, I initially wanted to call the book Persistence as a title. That didn't happen, but I love this image. I thought this would be the perfect cover of the book because this is a photograph from the mid-1970s of a scientist at UNLV named James Deacon, who worked with the pupfish for about 40 years and passed away in 2015. And here you see him looking totally exhausted in front of Devil's Hole, which is littered with a variety of management interventions that were aimed at keeping the pupfish alive during a particularly difficult period when the water level in the pool was declining. And so I've always loved that image, and it suggests the really tremendous hard work of attempting to protect many threatened species. So, all right, so how has the pupfish survived? Well, one of the ways that the pupfish has survived is through its relationship with science. And that's not just modern science or the science of the 1970s. That relationship began when the first pupfish were collected by scientists and placed in jars full of alcohol to be preserved for their later study. So the photograph here, by the way, all the photographs here that are uncredited are all mine, and any of the other ones are all cited. So this photograph I took in the Smithsonian in a facility just outside of Washington, D.C., where the fishes collection is housed. And these 4 jars are have pupfish, preserved pupfish at the bottom that were collected in 1891. So they've been in jars or similar jars since for about 125 years when I looked at them, and they were all collected in ash meadows. And the jar second from the left, 46107, is the first 10 pupfish ever collected from Devil's Hole. And here's a view of that jar. I pointed my camera right down the jar, so I'm kind of standing over it looking down. And there you can see a couple of those specimens, as well as the tags that they use. They actually just keep them inside the jar in alcohol because it also preserves the paper. So that relationship of the pupfish, and one of the keys to the pupfish's survival was someone actually going to the desert and carting a bunch of them away in alcohol. And that was a US Department of Agriculture survey that was conducted in 1891. And the significant thing about collecting fish is that it allows their bodies to be examined later. And the scientists who showed up at Devil's Hole didn't already call this species the Devil's Hole pupfish. They did not have a Latin name for it. And it's only through the investigation of these specimens that they came to be categorized and placed in the sort of the tree of life. And so that happens in a really particular way. This is a scientist named Carl Hubbs. He worked with the pupfish for about 50 years and played a role in their survival in a few different ways. And here he is, at his lab bench with his jars of fishes in the background. But if you look at his hands, he's holding a fish in one hand, and he has a measuring device, calipers, in the other hand, right? So it's through the measuring of different parts of these fishes that they come to separate them and turn them into species. And so this modern view of the Death Valley region as having 10 species or subspecies of pupfish is only produced by this really particular kind of scientific effort of examining dead pupfish. There's a lot more to it than that I could talk about, but the basic principle is that that the Devil's Hole pupfish got a name and became unique in the eyes of scientists only in the 1930s and early 1940s. That was not inevitable. A different set of scientists might have grouped all these fish together, but the ones that appeared there and worked in this period separated them and said that Cyprinodon diabolus, the Devil's Hole pupfish, is the most unique among this group. And that has played a truly important role in their survival for the rest of the 20th century and up to the present. All right, so once this species was unique, scientists, including Carl Hubbs, that scientist who I just showed, suggested that in fact, the uniqueness of this fish should serve as the basis of its protection within the national park system. And so parks over time, the National Park Service through Death Valley National Park has been a major reason that the pupfish have survived. The similarly unique fish like the Las Vegas dace, which lived in meadows in Las Vegas, was not so lucky. It ended up in the middle of what became a very large urban area, and it became extinct in the 1950s. But the Devil's Hole pupfish ended up in Death Valley National Park. It did so, however, pretty much over the objections of the Park Service. After it was proposed that Death Valley National Park add Devil's Hole to Death Valley, they said, no thanks. This is 1950, no thanks. But Carl Hubbs, that same scientist, made a stink and wrote a pretty cool letter to the Park Service leadership and said that, among other things, perhaps I have been naive in assuming that preservation of nature was among the basic reasons for and functions of the National Park Service. I would hate to think of your department as only a national playground service. And And so I don't know if anyone wants to take a screenshot of that, just in case they have to send a nasty gram to the Park Service at some point, but it's a pretty good burn. And it also really spoke to how the Park Service truly was not always interested in preserving the ecological communities that preserving the ecology of the places that it managed. And it certainly wasn't interested in preserving fish that visitors would not really see or appreciate, at least in their mindset at the time. But nonetheless, they have over time become crucially important and have done a lot of work to make sure that the pupfish it has survived. A third theme, an issue that I really enjoyed writing about in the book, and that played a massive role in the species' survival, has been around the use and misuse of water. It's said, you know, in the West that water runs uphill towards money and power, and the pupfish in the 1960s did not have any money, and the scientists who studied them did not have very much power. But nonetheless, during the course of the 1960s and 1970s, a pretty dramatically different relationship between water law and the pupfish developed, such that the species was able to persist. And I'll just tell a little bit of that story. It's a little complicated, but a rancher, this is an image of a ranch that was basically built directly around Devils Hole starting in 1968. And they pumped a massive amount of groundwater such that the water level in Devils Hole and that shallow shelf that the pupfish need to survive began to decline really quickly and expose that shallow shelf. And so this is a photo of in 1970 of the water level recorder that the U.S. Geological Survey had in Devils Hole. And you can see the stilling well in the box where the actual recorder is. And it was high and dry as they wrote, and they had to move it to a different place in order to continue to record the decline in the pool itself. But it was a moment that I think suggests the importance of having a lot of eyes trained on the pupfish in why this new relationship with water emerged. This is a meeting held in May 1970 after local biologists and some conservationists and Park Service, Cal Fish and Game, Nevada Department of Fish and Game got together and basically forced the Interior Department to investigate why it was that the water level was declining in Devils Hole, which would almost surely cause their extinction. After about 7 years, the fight over the water that was in Devils Hole made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And in June of that year, the Supreme Court decided that the Park Service had a right to the water to support the pupfish over the ranch that had developed around it. And this memo here is in the Carl Hubbs papers at UC San Diego, and he was in Alaska at this fisheries conference when this happened, and Phil Peaster, who is a fish biologist at California Department of Fish and Game, called the university and got this message written down, which was then handed to Hubbs, and he kept that piece of paper and it remains in his papers. He also interrupted the meeting and announced it to the room of biologists. So despite these relationships, right, to science, to the parks, and to water rights, which would seem to work together to save the pupfish, the pupfish are no respecter of persons. They do not cooperate always, and in the mid-1990s, for reasons that remain somewhat obscure, I could talk about that in the question and answer, the population began to decline, and it has remained depressed ever since. And so those same agencies that work to save the pupfish through this water rights case have worked in new ways to try and save the pupfish, including, and forging new relationships with the species, including by basically building a replica of Devil's Hole. And that's, it's me standing there with the former manager of this facility, and we're looking down at the replica of that shallow shelf, which then is connected to a 100,000 gallon tank. And so this is located just a couple miles from Devil's Hole. It's a pretty interesting place to visit. All right, so far, what I've done is kind of take you through how I came to my question about survival. I came to this question of survival through extinction, essentially, and then just describe some of the ways and the relationships that have allowed the pupfish to persist. And I would just like to close with a few comments about thinking about what climate change might mean to the pupfish. Now, I want to just start with this observation that I'll return to, which is that the first relationship that wildlife have with humans is, I think, pretty rarely simply about rising parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere and about rising ambient temperatures. Instead, their relationships are much older between people and wildlife, and the environments themselves have been changed in pretty dramatic ways even before the parts per million began rising. So I'll come back to that. Okay, so I brought up this image again of this shallow shelf, and this is going to be important. This is, again, where the pupfish reproduce exclusively. I mentioned that the water temperature is pretty much constant, 92 degrees. But on this shallow shelf, in this very shallow part of the pool, the temperatures can and do spike, especially when it gets direct sunlight and when the summertime temperatures are very warm in the Amargosa Desert. So one of the things we know about, thanks to that water level recorder that I had a photo of, is that the water level, after it dropped as a result of the ranching in the 1970s, did recover, but not fully, not to that pre-pumping level. So on the left side of this image, it's showing the water level, and on the left side we see in the 1960s that that water level was stable and pretty high below, and the numbers really just are below a reference marker. And then as we get into the 80s, 90s, and into the present, it's also stable. It's been slightly rising, but it's still substantially below the pre-pumping era. And so a hydrologist named Mark Hausner, who works at the University of Nevada, Reno, he looked at these moments where the temperatures on this shallow shelf were spiking to the point that they passed a threshold with which it would be unlikely that pupfish could be successfully spawned. It's simply too hot, not enough oxygen. And he studied that for a while. And he also thought about when food was most available on that shallow shelf, because in the winter there isn't a lot of food in Devil's Hole without any direct sunlight. And he came up with this model that showed, based on the temperature that's going on in this shallow shelf and how much food there is available, how the amount of time that will be available for the pupfish to reproduce has changed over time and is likely to change in the future. So he said, based on his work, that from, during the 1980s, there were about 74 days where the pupfish could reproduce. The present, that's already 10 years old now, is reduced to 68 days as a result of rising ambient temperatures in the desert as a result of climate change. And then he looked out and projected, using these different climate models, what is likely to happen in the future. And under the most extreme climate model, the business as usual model, by the end of the century, the number of days for which the pupfish would have to reproduce would be reduced to just 57 days. Now, the difference between 74 and 57 may not seem like a lot, but these fish don't, each individual fish only lives for a year. And this represents a pretty substantial contraction in their ability to reproduce. And they already have quite a low population. So, okay, climate change is affecting the pupfish. That's the like sort of first order message here, right? But what I want to point to, and something Hausner also pointed to, is that the history of the pupfish's relationship with people is essential for understanding what's happening, because he ran his model as if he also ran his model as if the pumping had never occurred, and that the shelf was deeper, and thus the water stayed cooler than it actually is. And so if no pumping had ever occurred in the around Devil's Hole, and the water level remained high, even under extreme warming scenarios, the available number of days for recruitment is over 74 days. So in other words, longer than it was during the 1980s. And so I sort of like this story, even though it's a little detailed. It's a little nuts. There's a lot of nuts and bolts. I like this story because what it suggests is that the pupfish are not being, pupfish are, of course, are being affected by climate change, but that interaction is being mediated by this other relationship with people, this groundwater pumping that happened in the past, long before we were really thinking as a society about climate change. And it means to me, ultimately, that there are all these mundane decisions, seemingly mundane decisions that we are making as a society constantly, that have long-run consequences for biodiversity that may seem at first to not really even be connected to climate change. Like how much should we even care that the water level is going down by a little bit? Well, that little bit turns out to mean quite a lot to the Devil's Hole pupfish. And especially given how far down the road we are in altering the climate, these regional and local decisions will play a very large role in what survives and what does not. And so I will close there, and I'll look forward to any and all of your questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Oh, I'm very happy to do it.
We can open up the Zoom for questions now, and maybe I'll just start by reading the few that are in the chat already.
Okay.
We have a question from Steve that says, are pupfish planted in the replica of Devil's Hole as part of the research? Is it open to the public?
Yeah, that's a great question. I probably should have stopped and talked a little more about that. The Devil's Hole 2, this pupfish facility out there, is used for research. The way that they do it, and the way they've operated it since about 2013, is they actually collect pupfish eggs from Devil's Hole on these little mats of carpet. Like they kind of expect the pupfish to swim through them and spawn. And then they take that back to the lab, raise them in these, just fish tanks, and then they deposit them into this habitat, and it's explicitly, used as a refuge for the pupfish to have a second population. As far as I know, it is not open to the public still. I think that there may be plans along those lines at some point, but it's just open to researchers right now. I visited once, and that was it when I first started the project.
Christopher is asking, who are the regional decision makers in the water pumping rates?
Yeah, great question. So the water, it's funny, if you live in the the West. So in our county, right, 90 whatever percent public land, your sort of assumption is that, oh, all this water must also be managed by the federal government. But in fact, unlike land, most water resources are managed by the state. And so in Nevada, the Nevada Division of Water Resources is the manager. However, this Supreme Court decision revolved around something called federal reserved water rights. And so the federal government basically said, we have an interest in this water that predates the interest of this rancher. And therefore, we have a right to it sufficient to support the pupfish. And so the state has been forced to comply with this sort of interjection into a state water system. And that means that the state went from a serious adversary when the story in the 70s, they were actually, in the lawsuit, they were on the side of the rancher against the federal government. But they've gone to becoming a kind of ally because they actually are implementing the restrictions that go into supporting the pupfish.
All right, we've got a lot of other questions coming in, so I'm just gonna keep reading through them, but feel free to follow up on any of these. How did pupfish come to inhabit Devil's Hole?
Yeah, so this is, oh man, it's such a great question, and I do write about it a little in the conclusion of the book. Am I still there? Oh, yeah. So for a long time, the assumption was basically, okay, you got, during the Pleistocene, there were all these lakes. The pupfish got isolated in one of these lakes. That then slowly, they just got isolated in Little Devil's Hole. And we know that Devil's Hole opened to the air about 60,000 years ago. So they must have got isolated around then, but who knows? And then about in 2014, a paper was published that used genetic analysis of the pupfish's DNA in comparison with other populations to say that actually they're not that different, and we think that they may only have separated from their closest relatives, maybe a few thousand years ago. And so we know for certain that there were no water connections, or pretty much know for certain there were no water connections a few thousand years ago. So how did they get in there? And then a couple years later, another paper said, actually, instead of a few thousand, we think it could have been as recently as 128 years ago or something like that. And that seems very recent. And so for these recent introduction theories, it requires a chance event, which of course is possible, like eggs of a pupfish getting stuck to the legs of a bird and being transported, which always reminds me a little bit of Monty Python with like, where did you get those coconuts from? Well, we found them, a bird carried them. But it is totally possible, it's a plausible explanation. The other possibility would be that Native Americans have introduced them. And Ash Meadows was, in the relatively recent past, heavily used by Western Shoshone and Southern Paiute people. But none of the research, these geneticists are not going out and doing anthropological work on that kind of question. So I don't know, I don't think there's much more to known about that. And then there's another group that says, no, they've been in there for 60,000 years. So it's like, it's a totally open question. It's totally fascinating. It has radical implications for how they are managed. If those fish have been in there for 60,000 years, they're, in evolutionary terms, they're bulletproof. But if they've been in there for 120 years, then perhaps they're undergoing genetic meltdown, mutational meltdown, and require some more invasive management strategies to protect them. So it's a fantastic question with like huge and totally interesting outcomes.
Let's see. Steve is asking, is there any possibility that the water level can be restored to the pre-pumping levels?
Yeah, so there's actually, right as I was finishing the book, the USGS water research group that focuses on Nevada and Southern Nevada produced like a more detailed model of their understanding of the groundwater flow system. And I think that the best scenario, like the best scenario for the pupfish anyway, is like no pumping after yesterday would not result in a rise to pre-pumping levels. In fact, it's likely that it will continue to decline through the end of the century. So in fact, they may be getting more vulnerable to this shorter window than was identified in the Hausner research that I shared.
Can you explain what the visitor experience is like at Devil's Hole? Can you usually see them?
Yeah, so you can if you bring a good pair of binoculars. So I think going to Devil's Hole is a great thing to do. It's totally unexpected. I think that my enjoyment of it has increased as I've learned more about them. The first time I went was right as I was starting this research, and I like went and didn't have any binoculars. Just kind of stood on the platform for a couple minutes and was like, all right, I guess there are fish down there. I guess I'm supposed to write about them. So it can be a little underwhelming in that way. But if you bring binoculars, you may see some pupfish. And then more broadly, I didn't really get into this, but the area around Devil's Hole, which is called Ash Meadows, is one way to think about it is as the Galapagos of the Intermountain West. It is home to 20-something endemic species. And it has all these other different springs that come out of the earth within a few miles of Devil's Hole. And so you can go and see one other different pupfish species close up. Like you could kneel down next to the water and kind of put your face close to the water and watch them scurry around. And that is truly awesome. It's super fun to do. There's also good birding out there.
Todd wants to know, are the different species of pupfish in Death Valley, Fish Slough, etc., all leftovers from a time when these tiny bodies of water were connected, an ancient lake?
Yeah, yes. So the first group of people to really wonder about these, the history of Pleistocene lakes in the Eastern Sierra and Nevada, were this group of biologists, including Carl Hubbs, because they were finding all these fish in these isolated springs, and they really wondered, like, how did they all get out here? And so it turns out there's, they did some interesting work to try and like connect all the dots to figure out what's the route that they all took, and it's pretty complicated because it's not just like one set of lakes. The water on this side of the Great Basin has been moving up and down for quite a while, and and as being next to Mono Lake, of course, we know some of that story too, where Mono Lake at one point spilled out of the basin. So there's similar stories to all the other kind of isolated basins, and that is responsible for kind of transporting these fishes around and then kind of trapping them.
Dewey Livingston says to everyone, this book is a real page turner. I recommend it to everyone in the whole country. Excellent writing, Casey. I agree.
That's very nice. You may be a little biased too.
David wants to know, he says, reminds me of the comments often made about tiny delta smelt in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta controversies and tiny brine shrimp in Mono Lake that were denigrated in the long battle to protect Mono Lake. What do you think about the quote tiny equals quote insignificant arguments that seem to be inherent in human nature?
Ooh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that. Well, I think there's some truth to that. That people say, well, I can't see it, so how much do we care? But I also think what's amazing is how flexible our ideas about nature are if you look at how passionate people have become about animals like the pupfish or the delta smelt. So the pupfish, by sort of normal standards of charisma, do not rank very high, right? We want to save like the polar bear and you know, cuter mammals, things like that. But people have become very attached to the pupfish, and now, I mean, you can go to Ash Meadows, go to the visitor center, and get like a little stuffed animal pupfish. And so the charisma of the pupfish has sort of been rehabilitated, and the fact that it's tiny is maybe one of the reasons people have gravitated to it. It's, you know, culturally or like emotionally, you know, it feels like an underdog. So why shouldn't we work to protect it? I don't know. That's interesting.
A few more comments here. Connie Millar, to everyone, thank you so much for this thoughtful analysis, Kevin. Your story is very important for many species, and I will consider your assessment as a way to communicate the persistence of American pika despite apparent vulnerability to warming. My question is, have there been recent molecular studies that confirm the morphological analysis of taxonomic separation of the pupfishes? Yeah,
that's awesome, Connie. I think the pika could definitely use the persistence story is definitely could work for them, I think. And I love, this is a great question because it goes back to the earliest pupfish research. So Carl Hubbs and his grad student, Robert Miller, they're doing all the work before, you know, the discovery of DNA, but they're committed Darwinists. You know, they're trying to understand the evolutionary journey that this group, the Cyprinodon fishes, have been on. And so they wonder about this exact question, like, wait, do these fish just look different because they're in different environments, or because they're genetically different? They didn't say it quite that way, but that's what they meant. And so they actually began to undertake experiments by gathering pupfish up from these different habitats and transplanting them to fishless springs in and around the West, with the plan to then come back, collect them, and see how their morphology had changed. Like, in other words, how did they come to look different based on being in a different kind of spring? And they never really completed that work, and it's kind of a clunky experiment from our perspective. But this explains how pupfish ended up at River Springs in the Adobe Valley. Robert Miller put Amargosa River pupfish and Salt Creek pupfish in there in 1940, and they persisted until they were removed so that the Owens pupfish could be protected there. But anyway, to answer the more practical question, like, yes, the genetic analysis does confirm they are different. Though there are like a bunch of really interesting like twists and turns. There's evidence of Devil's Hole. There's introgression of Devil's Hole genes in other pupfishes in the recent past. And so it's hard to explain that without accounting for people. And so I did some of that, a little bit of that work to kind of try and talk about people moving pupfishes around to explain some of this.
Marcia asks, can you speak to the pupfish near Bishop if they are monitored, and if so, by what entity? What is the fate of these outlying pupfish?
Yeah, so the pupfish near Bishop are Owens pupfish. They're also unique species, Cyprinodon radiosus. They were also have a similar kind of story. Also, it's pretty dramatic. They were thought to be extinct as the result of water diversions by Los Angeles. And in 1964, Carl Hubbs, the same biologist, and his graduate student, Robert Miller, they went back to see if they could discover them, and they did. And then a few years later, Phil Peaster, who some of you may know about, he their one little refuge population was undergoing it was basically being dewatered, and Phil arrived and realized that he had to move all these fishes, and he carried the the 2 buckets of Owen's pupfish to a new habitat, and he carried the whole species in a bucket. He has an article about it. So it's pretty dramatic, like rescue of that species as well. And they are endangered. They continue to be monitored by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife out of their Bishop office.
And following on that question, do you know about the effort to reintroduce pupfish on the Bishop Paiute Reservation COSO area?
I don't. I would love to know more about it, though. That's really interesting. But I can't offer any intel on that project.
And then Gulid asks, can you please repeat what the sensitivity of pupfish to the water table level is? For example, microenvironment for breeding.
So the pupfish have the shelf itself that they sit on. I think this is what Gled's getting at. Is really between just a few inches to a couple feet deep. But prior to pumping, it would have been about twice that in depth, and would actually also increase in surface area or total submerged bottom, because it's not just like a cylinder, right? It spreads out as you go up, so there's more space, and so the sensitivity of it seems to be very high, especially. There's two elements of the aquifer. There's a carbonate aquifer, and then there's like a alluvial aquifer, but it seems to respond to both. And as far as I remember, and the total amount of pumping that went on, while like kind of a lot from the perspective of a cattle ranch, is not a lot like compared to like a city operating for decades. It didn't take a long time. It took from the time they started operating like 5 electric pumps. It took less than a year for there to be a drawdown that would have extirpated them, would have made them extinct. I mean, at its lowest level by 1972, so within 4 years, it was down only like 10 or 15% of the shelf was still submerged. So it's pretty sensitive, I guess.
Eileen is wondering if you can make a plug for the visitor center there. She says it is a beautiful, unexpected educational experience and oasis.
Yes, totally. They were building the visitor center at Ash Meadows, they had a double wide for many years, and they replaced that with this really wonderful interpretive center that's connected to these boardwalks that let you kind of get out and see some of the other pupfish in the area. It's a great place to go. Definitely worth it.
And Christopher put in the chat a link to a great recent article on the Owens pupfish in the New York Times, also available with your Mono County Library card on the website at monocolibraries.org.
Yeah,
and,
that was a great article. I totally agree. Yeah, and much more up to date on the Owens pupfish than I am, I'm sure.
And Dave wants to know, any more books coming from you?
Oh, I don't think right now, but Nora will attest that every once in a while I'm like, I should write a book about that. But I'm pretty committed to taking a break.
How would you summarize your experience of writing a book?
It has occasional moments that are very rewarding, but it is also seems, at least in my perspective, is primarily about making yourself do it. Like the sitting down and doing it sometimes does not feel super fantastic, but it turns out if you do that like every day, then eventually it gets better, and eventually it's done. Yeah, Dave Carl has it there. Just do it. There's no substitute. He knows. He's written a bunch of books.
We have a message from Bill saying, thanks, Kevin and Beth and all who helped this come together. Good stuff. Miss you all here in Tucson. And I just would like to say thank you, all of you, for tuning in tonight. Thank you, Kevin, for your time. And I wish you all a safe and happy season.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Beth, for hosting, and thank you everyone for being here. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Good night.
Hey, night.
Bravo.